China reaffirmed its claim over the disputed Scarborough Shoal in the South China Sea after the Philippine government removed the floating barrier to prevent Filipino fishing boats from entering the area. Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesman Wang Wenbin said the shoal and its adjacent waters are China's inherent territory, and therefore Beijing has indisputable sovereign rights in the disputed waters. The Chinese claims are mostly based on its historical rights during the Han Dynasty, dating back over 2,000 years ago. In modern history, China backed its sovereignty claim and related rights over this territory in accordance with the 1943 Cairo Declaration and the 1945 Potsdam Proclamation. After World War II, Japan returned to China the Chinese territories it had occupied, including Taiwan and the Penghu Islands, the Xisha Islands, and the Nansha Islands. However, the 2016 Arbitral Tribunal under the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea invalidated China's historical claims over the disputed waters of the South China Sea. The tribunal dealt with the question of whether China's claims to historic rights within the 9- line, now 10- line, were in conformity with UNCLOS. It was first observed that this area, in which China claimed rights, formed in the long historical course to living and non-living resources like fisheries and petroleum resources, partially overlaps with areas that would otherwise comprise the exclusive economic zone or the continental shelf of the Philippines. In the view of the tribunal, UNCLOS establishes a comprehensive maritime zones regime and allocates rights in these areas to the coastal state and other states. In the areas of the EEZ and the continental shelf, the coastal state enjoys exclusive sovereign rights to the exploitation of living and non-living natural resources. Concerning the rights of other states in these areas, the tribunal found that UNCLOS does not permit the preservation of the historic rights of any state within the EEZ or the continental shelf of another state. Therefore, after the entry into force of UNCLOS, the historic rights that might have existed for China within the 9- line in areas that would otherwise include the EEZ or the CS of the Philippines were superseded by the maritime zones regime created by UNCLOS. That means the pre-existing historic rights no longer exist as they are not compatible with UNCLOS. Accordingly, the tribunal concluded that China's claims were contrary to UNCLOS and exceeded the geographic limits imposed by it. The award addresses three main substantive issues. First, the so-called 9- line and China's claim to historic rights in the South China Sea. Second, the status of certain maritime features in the South China Sea. And third, the legality of Chinese activities in the South China Sea. Because of jurisdictional limits, however, the arbitral tribunal did not deal with matters related to territorial sovereignty over the disputed maritime features between the parties. That means that the tribunal did not decide who owned the maritime features located in the South China Sea, such as the Spratly Islands, that are claimed by both China and the Philippines or any other coastal state in the region. Similarly, the tribunal did not delimit any maritime boundaries between the Philippines and China in the South China Sea. The tribunal also ruled on the legality of the activities of Chinese officials and Chinese vessels in the areas of the South China Sea located within the Philippines' EEZ and continental shelf. It concluded that China breached the provisions of UNCLOS, in particular by temporarily prohibiting fishing in areas of the South China Sea falling within the Philippines' EEZ. Failing to prevent Chinese vessels from fishing in the Philippines' EEZ at Mischief Reef and Second Thomas Shoal, and preventing Filipino fishermen from engaging in traditional fishing at Scarborough Shoal. Regarding China's construction of artificial islands, installations, and structures at Mischief Reef, an LTE that is part of the Philippines' EEZ and continental shelf, without the authorization of the Philippines, the tribunal also found China to have violated UNCLOS. In addition, with respect to the protection and preservation of the marine environment in the South China Sea, the tribunal found that China breached UNCLOS since it failed to prevent fishermen from Chinese-flagged vessels from harvesting endangered species on a significant scale and in such a manner as to destroy the coral reef ecosystem. Furthermore, the tribunal held that China's land reclamation and construction of artificial islands, installations, and structures in the Spratly Islands caused severe, irreparable harm to the coral reef ecosystem. The Philippines welcomed the award, which vindicated most of its claims, and stated that it remained open to negotiate with China. Conversely, China rejected the decision as illegal, null, and void and therefore without any binding effect on itself. Other countries, including the United States, Vietnam, Australia, and Japan, backed the Philippines and called on China to respect the tribunal's decision. On the other hand, Cambodia supported China's non-acceptance of the award. And a new national map produced by Beijing is the latest expansive conception of its borders to outrage its neighbors. The Philippines, Malaysia, Vietnam, Taiwan, and India all of which have territorial disputes with China, have objected to the 2023 version of the country's standard map, released on the 28th of August by the Chinese Ministry of Natural Resources. The map includes a U-shaped line that reaffirms Beijing's claims to sovereignty over almost all of the South China Sea, including the West Philippine Sea, a resource-rich and strategically important region through which trillions of dollars in trade flows each year. The line extends into the exclusive economic zones of a number of countries. It also includes the Indian state of Arunachal Pradesh and the Aksai Chin, in the Himalayan border, which China controls but India also claims, and the Russian territory of Bolshoi-Ussuriysky Island. At least 6 neighboring countries have objected to China's new standard national map, which features a 10-dash line, instead of the previous 9 dashes, used to stake claims on the South China Sea, with an additional dash to the east of Taiwan. The new map repeats the 9-dash line claims made by China and rejected by the United Nations Law of the Sea Tribunal, while also claiming new territory around Taiwan and to the north of India. This comes days after President Xi Jinping declared at the latest BRICS summit that hegemonism is not in China's DNA. China has put one new dash in the eastern section of the democratic island of Taiwan. Beijing sees Taiwan as a renegade province subject to reunification. Also, inside this 10-dash line are the entire Spratly Islands, which include the Kalayaan Island group. ASEAN members issued a joint communiqué reaffirming the need to avoid actions that might escalate tensions in the South China Sea and to seek the peaceful resolution of disputes in accordance with international law, including UNCLOS. The tribunal's ruling is certainly a legal victory for the Philippines over China, as the judges agreed unanimously on almost all the questions submitted by the Philippines, including a declaration from the tribunal that China is obliged to comply with UNCLOS and that the award is legally binding on China. There is no enforcement mechanism as such under UNCLOS in the event that China fails to comply with the tribunal's decision, but the Philippines could either resort to diplomatic ways, bilateral or multilateral negotiations within the framework of international organizations, or have recourse to further arbitration under UNCLOS. Moreover, other states and non-state actors could take further actions such as economic sanctions to put pressure on Beijing to shift its behavior. But, beyond China's non-compliance attitude, the award has value for the states bordering the South China Sea and the rest of the international community for 2 reasons. The tribunal's ruling clarified the respective rights and obligations of both China and the Philippines in the South China Sea, thereby facilitating their further relations, and the tribunal's findings might have an impact on policy considerations and decision-making of other states as it clarified important legal issues in UNCLOS. Why does the South China Sea matter? The 1.3 million square mile waterway is vital to international trade, with an estimated third of global shipping worth trillions of dollars passing through each year. It's also home to vast fertile fishing grounds upon which many lives and livelihoods depend. Much of its economic value remains untapped, however. According to the U.S. Energy Information Agency, the waterway holds at least 190 trillion cubic feet of natural gas and 11 billion barrels of oil. Who controls those resources and how they are exploited could have a huge impact on the environment. The South China Sea is home to hundreds of largely uninhabited islands and coral atolls, and diverse wildlife at risk from climate change and marine pollution. Beijing claims indisputable sovereignty over almost all of the South China Sea, and most of the islands and sandbars within it, including many features that are hundreds of miles from mainland China. The Philippines, Malaysia, Vietnam, Brunei and Taiwan also hold competing claims. In 2016, an international tribunal in The Hague ruled in favor of the Philippines in a landmark maritime dispute, which concluded that China has no legal basis to claim historic rights to the bulk of the South China Sea. China has ignored the ruling. Manila says Beijing continues to send its maritime militia to Mischief Reef and Scarborough Shoal in the Philippines' exclusive economic zone. In the southern portion of the sea is the Spratly Island chain, which Beijing calls the Nansha Islands. The archipelago consists of 100 islets and reefs, of which 45 are occupied by China, Taiwan, Malaysia, Vietnam, or the Philippines. In the northwestern part of the sea, the paracels, known as the Xisha Islands in China, have been controlled by Beijing since 1974 despite claims from Vietnam and Taiwan. China's ruling Communist Party also claims self-governing Taiwan as its own territory, despite having never controlled it. Under President Ferdinand Bongbong Marcos Jr., the Philippines has taken increasingly assertive steps to protect its claim to shoals in the South China Sea, leading to several confrontations with Chinese vessels in waters off the Philippine Islands. They include standoffs between the Chinese Coast Guard and what Manila says are shadowy Chinese maritime militia boats and tiny wooden Philippine fishing vessels, Chinese water cannons blocking the resupply of a shipwrecked Philippine military outpost, and a lone Filipino diver using a knife to sever a massive floating Chinese barrier. These recent incidents in the past year show that China has become increasingly aggressive and confident in its actions against smaller countries like the Philippines. The Philippine Coast Guard says it remains committed to upholding international law, safeguarding the welfare of Filipino fisherfolk, and protecting the rights of the Philippines in its territorial waters. China's foreign ministry has defended the behavior of its vessels in the waterway and said Beijing will firmly safeguard what it views as its territorial sovereignty. Since taking office in 2022, Philippine President Marcos Jr. has taken a stronger stance over the South China Sea than his predecessor, Rodrigo Duterte's, amid the wider power struggle that has been playing out in the region for years. The South China Sea is widely seen as a potential flashpoint for global conflict, and the recent confrontations between Manila and Beijing have raised concerns among Western observers of potentially developing into an international incident if China, a global power, decides to act more forcefully against the Philippines, a U.S. treaty ally. Washington and Manila are bound by a mutual defense treaty signed in 1951 that remains in force, stipulating that both sides would help defend each other if either were attacked by a third party. Marcos has strengthened U.S. relations that had frayed under his predecessor, with the two allies touting potential future joint patrols in the South China Sea.